coming up right now. There we go. Let's go to the slides. We'll do these. Let me get rid of that. Okay. Closing math, among other things. Here we go. We talked about some procedures. We know the difference between settlement and closing. We went through all of that. We talked about the wood destroying insect report, WDIR. It's not just termites. Some people call it a termite letter, but it's carpenter bees, it's powder post beetles, anything that eats wood and therefore could affect the structural integrity. Those are what that inspector's looking for. The timeline, when does the inspections need to be finished by? Best practice in the under contract period. At what point do we need to make sure as the broker that the inspections, including survey, including appraisal, including any reason that the buyer might need to justify backing out of the contract, when does that need to be done? There you go. That magical due diligence deadline is the date. And sometimes that loan approval isn't finished by then, right? We've got our deadline. We've got our under contract period. We've got our due diligence deadline. And that loan approval maybe isn't quite done yet. Well, as long as the party's buyer, for instance, feels like it's going well, the mortgage lender is the loan originator, a loan officer, is saying, yeah, everything looks pretty good. We don't have official approval, and quite often you don't. At best, you might have conditional loan approval, and that could be okay. Just make sure that your buyer is okay with it, because if we venture into this part of the timeline, sorry, it's overlapping the words. Now, if they back out later for any reason, they're also going to be walking away from that earnest money too. So be careful there. What about the repairs? When are those repairs handled? The repairs were handled. We have our under contract, our closing date, our due diligence. At what point are the repairs handled? That one or this one? Before or after the due diligence period? Long as the closing has not happened yet, right? So we just need to get the negotiations of repairs done by due diligence deadline, but the repairs themselves can be done as long as they're done before. Let's be more diligent about this. Not quite the closing day. Let's make it the final walk. Final walkthrough is the best time by which to have those repairs done, right? So watch out for that. What about the seller's choices? What can the seller do about these repairs? What are the options? They can say, yes, I'll fix everything, because that buyer has asked for maybe items 1, 3, 7, 13. And that seller is going to say, well, yeah, I'll do this one and this one because they're the cheapest ones, but I'm not doing these ones. No. And so it's just another negotiation. Maybe the parties say, maybe they go back and forth quite a bit, but it's just another set of negotiations, and the seller could say yes to everything or yes to some things or no to everything as well, just to be a negotiation. We talked about the different things that the parties could do, or different things that the parties have to pay for. Let's see. What about the deed preparation? Deed prep. Who pays for deed prep? Yeah, that's a seller expense. Seller's paying for that one. The seller's washing the car before they sell it, preparing the house before they sell it. They pay for that. And for your information, anywhere from $400 to $600 typically. You won't be tested on that part. What about excise tax? Whose expense is excise tax? Yep, another seller one. What about commission? Another seller one, right? This is stuff you're going to need to know when they ask you these closing questions. We're going to get into that math, and part of what they're testing is not just how to do the math, but who has to pay for what things. What about a recording fee? Recording the deed. Paying to record the deed at the courthouse probably costs $50, maybe $25 to $50, not that much. But who cares about recording the deed the most? The new deed is something the buyer cares about, right? So that's a buyer expense. What about discount points? Who's paying the discount points unless the test question tells you more details? The one who cares about them. So for the most part, the buyer. However, it could be a builder. It could be a seller. It could be an agent, for that matter. If it holds the deal together and it makes it so that buyer can actually buy the house, yeah, I'll buy a discount point. Sure. Let's just get to closing. Closed money brings commissions, right? What about, origination fee? Who pays that? Buyer as well, because it benefits the buyer because the lender charges it. What about this one? Private mortgage insurance. Who's paying PMI for that conventional loan? Or MIP if it were an FHA loan? There we go again. The one who benefits is the buyer because without PMI, the lender won't make the loan. The lender's the one who benefits from it, but the buyer pays for it. Well done. So what else? We looked at the loan estimate, and we also looked at the closing disclosure, and we learned a couple things. There are some categories. We saw they were labeled A, B, and C, and we saw it right there on the loan estimate sheet. One of them were the lender fees. Let me do it this way. One of them is a zero tolerance category where everything charged is tolerance, meaning the lender has no ability to charge over it. If the lender charges more than, then they are going to have to take the hit themselves. So zero tolerance means the lender has to charge more if the numbers they gave on the loan estimate are higher. They're going to have to absorb it. So let me make that easier to read. Zero tolerance. Another one is a 10% tolerance. And then another one is a no limit category, meaning if the lender suggests it and it ends up being more than it, the lender has no obligation to cover that overage. So A was lender fees. B were items the lender suggests or makes a recommendation of from a list. They have to be paid, but it's the lender's direction from a list the lender provides. And then C are items that the complete discretion of the buyer. Which one of these, A, B, or C, is the zero tolerance category? Whatever the lender quotes must be what actually happens. For instance, if the lender says the origination fee is going to be 1%, but it turns out it's 2%, the lender's going to have to eat that extra percent overage. That's what we're talking about. What's a zero tolerance category, A, B, or C? The lender fees they quote, the suggested items from a list, provided list, or the things where the borrower chooses the provider.
The fees they quote.
You got it. It's lined up, isn't it? Right? Zero tolerance are the lender fees. They have full control. I can choose what I charge you as a broker, right? This is not to do with that, but it's sort of like it. But the lender says origination fee is going to be this, flood certification is going to be that. These are fees they choose to charge. You might have heard the term fluff fees when somebody looks at a loan estimate, or back in the old days, a good faith estimate. If it had a whole bunch of extra fees built in, that might be a lender that doesn't get picked, because that lender's just trying to charge. They advertise a low rate, but it's because they charge a whole bunch of fluff over here too. So that's kind of what we're getting at. The items the lender suggests, things like from a list, from a provided list that the borrower chooses from, those are no more than 10%, meaning if they end up costing more than 10%, the lender has to absorb it. And then the items that the buyer has the discretion to pick, like an inspection, another inspection, things like that, survey, those sorts of things, the lender has no responsibility to cover, and they will not be held accountable for those things. Let's go ahead and take our break. When we come back, we will keep moving forward and get to some math here shortly. See you in 10 minutes.
my boy. One day he'll be big and strong, and he won't have a lot of gold. He's my pride and joy.
Okay, let's come on back together. There we go. Welcome back. Okay, continuing our review time. Remember the timeline between loan application and closing day. We've got the loan application when the property goes under contract. Somewhere around that time is a good time to go ahead and apply for the loan. Pick the lender and do the loan application somewhere around in here. We've got our due diligence deadline. We've got our closing day. And there's a timeline about that loan estimate. When does the loan estimate have to be provided? Within 3 days of when? Loan estimate to be provided within 3 days of what?
Application.
Yeah, the front end, right? Yeah, the loan application. Got 3 days from the application applying for the loan for that lender to give the loan estimate to the borrower. Let's see. Let me do it this way. Oops. Okay. Yeah, good. That one. So there's that. And then fast forward to the closing day. We have 3 days before closing day for the closing disclosure to be provided to the borrower. Not us as brokers, but the lender. The lender has this requirement on their shoulders. What do we do about it as brokers? We make sure it's done, but it's really a requirement of the lender to get this to that borrower. So don't forget the 3 days for the loan estimate, 3 days from when. What constitutes loan application? How do we know loan application date? What is that date? The date they've applied for the loan, and also what? Identified. Applying for that loan, they had to tell the lender what? What are they going to borrow the money to buy? So loan application date is the date an address is given. The property address is given. That constitutes this loan application date that we're talking about. So don't forget, TILA RESPA requires this thing. Also, TILA RESPA, what is that? TILA RESPA, I'm trying to underline this thing. Okay, almost. There we go. Well, that's still ugly. TILA RESPA is another acronym. When we use them both together, something called TRID. You might see this in your reading. TRID stands for TILA RESPA Information Disclosure. TRID is just an acronym full of acronyms, right? And it says all of the things that you have to do, or not us, but a lender has to do when it comes to RESPA requirements and Truth in Lending. TILA, by the way, stands for Truth in Lending Act. Got to tell the truth when you're loaning money. Got to give them the scoop. Got to give them the numbers, the percentages, the dollar amounts, and they are obligated to do so. Okay, we talked about our tolerances. RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, RESPA also controls business arrangements. Borrowers getting credit for something called yield spread premiums. Escrow account restrictions, we did talk about that some, meaning when the lender says, we're going to set up an escrow account for taxes and insurance so that your monthly payment of PITI has the taxes and insurance part, it's going to go into that escrow account so the money is available when it comes due. They don't have to pay the taxing authority every month. They can't. When can that property tax be paid? What's the first date by which the property tax could possibly be paid? It can't be paid until when in the year? That's going to matter today. Tonight we're going to do math that has and requires that date. Yeah, there you go. September 1st. Nobody can pay it any sooner than that. So it's just going to sit in that escrow account, and setting up that escrow account is going to require a certain number of months of taxes. How do we know what that is? It depends on whatever the lender says to the attorney. The lender tells the attorney, hey, attorney, here's what I want you to do. I want you to collect this many months of taxes. And it just depends on the lender's requirements. There's no standard answer there. The lender might say 3 months, 5 months, could be anything. It's going to depend on the time in the year of closing, whatever the lender feels comfortable. Because think about the escrow account as sort of a gas gauge, right, in your car. They're going to set up a certain minimum amount of taxes, and then over the year with every payment, one payment is 1/12 of the taxes. That's going to be added in, and then let's make it a different color. That'll be added in. The next month's going to be a different, another 1/12 along the way, and it's just going to eventually get to a point where the whole thing has enough money in it, and then some. It's going to have more than enough money because they need to have and maintain that cushion so that there's always enough money. This year we're in, this current year, here in Cabarrus County, we all got a notification that our tax values increased. Some people's tax values went up a couple $100,000. That means some people's tax bills went up to the tune of maybe even $1,000 more, or several $100s more. And it caused a lot of concern. one trade-off they're going to make supposedly is in July, when that tax rate is determined, maybe they'll adjust that down a little bit to help make up for the increased tax value. We'll see. Because every year in July is when we find out what the tax rate is going to be. Remember the $1.30 per $100 or the 14 mils or whatever way that jurisdiction handles tax rates. So watch out for that. The escrow account restrictions, the lender is in the business of making money like any bank. And so you better believe if a bank could get away with taking your money and just keeping it, not even that they want to keep it forever, but they just want to hold on to it so that they are free to invest it and make a return on your money, which is what the bank's doing with your savings account and your checking account, by the way. You better believe they would. And so escrow account restrictions, let's see, right there. Yep. Limit what the lender is allowed to collect for creating these escrow accounts. That's what that's all about. Sorry, 1 second. Our friend Jack lost his power. Here we go. Okay. RESPA, let's see. Oh yeah, this one. No kickbacks. RESPA also says brokers. This is one of the few things RESPA pertains to us about. Two main things RESPA pertains to real estate brokers about. This is one of them. The other one is trigger terms. If we advertise one thing, we have to advertise other things. But this one we're talking about is kickbacks. If we recommend a closing attorney or an inspector, it better be because that's a good inspector, not because they're going to slide us $100 bill for bodies, right? Here's a lead, give me money. Not allowed. Because why? It affects the integrity of your recommendation. And the RESPA is all about trying to make sure that the lender, buyer, borrower is taken care of. And then finally, let's see, our obligations as a broker, we have to review the closing disclosure to make sure certain things are accurate, but not everything. What things do we, the broker, have to verify when we receive that closing disclosure? What are we required to verify and make sure is working okay? They did the math right. You know, it's not like they get a pen out and a calculator and write on paper. They're doing this with a spreadsheet, but they could put things in the wrong blank, in the wrong cell on the spreadsheet, and that could be completely the opposite of the thing they're supposed to do. I've seen mistakes all the time. And so we as brokers have to make sure the stuff from the contract, basically, that we have to do with are correct. We don't, or we are not responsible for lender fees. That is not for us to have to double check on that closing disclosure. Only contract and negotiation things like repair items. If there was a warranty, that money for collecting that money for the warranty got included, that sort of thing. So these are all the possible things that could fall within our scope. And then finally, violating RESPA, taking a kickback, or running an ad with a trigger term, just one, but not all the other ones. Don't forget this. This is an easy to miss question about trigger terms. Can you advertise with them? Yes. You can say, for trigger terms, it's a great way to advertise, frankly. You get a lender to write a scenario worksheet on the property. Here's what the loan could look like. And you say you could own this house for $1,800 a month. And that's a good way to get people's interest. Instead of making them think of it like a $500,000 house, think of it like $1,800 a month. I don't know if those numbers make sense, but the thing is, you better tell the interest rate, you better tell the number of payments, you better tell the amount borrowed, the loan amount. Those 4 or 5 trigger terms have to be disclosed if you do choose to advertise any one of them. And if you don't, if you get that wrong, or if you take those kickbacks, then you're looking at $10,000 fine per violation, 1 year imprisonment. It's a criminal thing too, guys. And loan fraud is no joke. Also, 3 times the damages in the event of a civil lawsuit. Okay, we got into this right before we ended last week, and we related it to your most basic of a checking account, not some super crazy accounting course anybody's ever taken. That talks about debits and credits a little differently, but your checking account is either money in or money out. And so we're just talking about this. It might look like this sort of a thing. The buyer's side, the seller's side, it's just a very rudimentary version of this, and the debits and the credits on the buyer's side and the debits and the credits on the seller's side. And so if we just had this form, this little worksheet, and we said, okay, what are some seller expenses? Well, we know excise tax is one. So that's in the seller debit column. We also know deed prep is another one. We know that the seller credit, the biggest one is the sales price. So that's a big fat one under the seller credit column. The buyer debit, the sale price is the biggest one on that side, right? Because they're paying for it. And then things like the loan amount they're borrowing from the lender is a credit because they get all of it at closing. They don't get to take it. They're using it, applying it toward the price of the house, putting it over here, adding it to their down payment and putting it over there, giving it to the seller. But essentially it counts as a buyer credit. That loan amount does. On the actual closing disclosure, they don't put the down payment. That is not its own line item on the closing disclosure because it doesn't need to be. It's going to be handled. That amount of money will be built in to the math by having the sale price and the loan amount, because the sale price minus the loan amount is the down payment. Does that make sense? So you won't see down payment as a line item on that closing disclosure. So we went into this sort of thing. What else? And on your test, there's something that I call affectionately the monster problem, because all the math, any of the math could be any one thing, like excise tax. Now calculate discount points. Now calculate commission. But there's going to be at least one, maybe two, that give you a whole bunch of details, some of which you don't need, and then ultimately asks you this: how much does the buyer need to bring? Or another question could be, how much will the seller get at closing? The number the buyer needs to bring, that's a very real world question. You better believe those parties want to know that. The seller wants to know, yeah, but how much am I getting after this closing is done? You will have done that math for them if you did a good job. At the point when you listed the property, you'll give them a seller net sheet. Say, this is what I anticipate, but that's sort of like the loan estimate. That's your version of the loan estimate. It's way back in the beginning. Now this closing disclosure is the thing that's going to show how good you were. Does that closing disclosure show the bottom line of what the seller's getting? And I pull that net sheet back I pull it out from my files from 30, 40 days ago, and I compare the two. And hopefully they're pretty close. If anything, the closing disclosure number is off to the high side. I told the seller they were going to have to pay more, they were going to get less than they really actually got. So it's sort of the great reckoning. That's the point at which you're sharing with them how good you were about estimating where they would be here at the closing. So we got into these terms. Let's go. We talked about the fees, and this concept of proration. Let me hit the highlights about calculations. This is not the only way anymore. This is an old slide. I need to update it. They might test you on real life. It used to be that for pre-licensing exams, the testing authorities would write the exam and say, all months are 30 days, therefore 12 months times 30 is 360 days for the year. And it was just one nice little feature and benefit of taking pre-licensing. You didn't have to keep track that February has 28 days and January has 30 and March has 31. I hope you know those numbers. There's different ways to learn it. There's like a knuckle method. There's also the little saying, what is it? 30 days hath September, April, June, and I forgot already. But I know them. I just don't remember the rhyme. So now it could be the real life scenario. They'll tell you in the test question how you need to add up those days and how they want you to do it, real life or this method. A couple other things about this. We are now moving into the phase of the closing disclosure sheet, right? So that means that closing disclosure showing the buyer's side and the seller's side and the debits and the credits and what they are each responsible for, and filling in the columns basically and figuring out the seller's getting down here this total and the buyer's bringing down here that total. So what about this timeline of the year? We've got one thing in particular as an example. We've got the taxes, the property taxes. January 1st is your first day of the year that you're obligated to pay taxes for that year. You don't pay them yet. You're not going to pay them all the way until September 1st. And then, of course, here's December 31st, the end of the year. But maybe the closing happens right here. Maybe let's just say April 3rd is our closing day. Closing day. Oops. I lost my, there we go. Closing day is April 3rd. Let me add something here. It might make it a little easier to look at. There we go. There we go. Okay. So what about the day of closing? Somebody's got to pay for that day. For the most part, in almost every case of calculating money except one, the seller is responsible for the day of closing. Another way you could say that is what's on the slide. Seller owns the day of closing. They have to pay for it. If they are receiving rent because it's an investment property, they get the rent for the day of closing as well as the first through that day in the month. But when it comes to expenses, seller has to pay for the day of closing, except that weird thing that we did at the end of the night last week called interim interest. That's the only calculation where the buyer pays for day of closing. Why? Because this one has nothing to do with the seller at all. It's about the buyer's new loan. The seller has nothing to do with the buyer's new loan, so therefore the buyer gets to pay for that day of closing. And you might be thinking, what's the big deal? But think about it from a perspective of the buyer. Here's our day of closing, and let's say we're closing at 4 p.m. There's only an hour left in the workday. And then what, 8 hours left in the whole day itself? And yeah, you got to pay a whole day's worth of interest, even though you're not even the owner for that full day, right? So that's just the way it is. And for a seller, same thing. Except for interim interest, the seller pays every item up to and including the day of closing. Remember that part, because I bet I would be very, I would not be surprised at all to see that multiple choice thing, those answer choices. And one of them is for 140 days, in the year, and another one is for 141. In other words, they will make the answer choices off by 1 day's worth of taxes because they want to make sure that you know and you answer it in the way such that the seller is responsible and paying for that day. Does that make sense? The answer choices will be such that if you forget that the seller owns the day of closing, you'll get it wrong. The answer choices will not be so close that a rounding error will mess you up. So if you choose to leave numbers in the calculator instead of clearing them out and then coming back in, then you're okay there. But the day of closing, I mean the extra day interest or the extra day taxes, that's different. They will test you on that. Okay. Let's actually do one, and then it'll make more sense, I think. So let me flip on over to the iPad. And let's do one. We've got let's say a closing on April 20th. We've got, I'm going to be nice. On the test, they could make you calculate the annual taxes, but I'm just going to give them to you. Annual taxes for the whole year, we're going to say are $2,350. That is the year's annual taxes. Close on April 20th. And the question is, let me do it this way. How will the taxes show up on the closing disclosure? The reason I ask it that way is you need to know debits versus credits. Who's going to be debited, who's going to be credited, buyer versus seller. If it's a proration, you've got to know taking money from one versus giving it to the other. So, what do we know? Step one, let's figure out the dollars per day of taxes. Dollars per day. If we know the year taxes are $2,350, divide by what? Let's just use the standard easy version. We'll do divide by 360 for now. So $2,350 divided by 360 days in the year means $6.53 per day. I'm rounding up to 2 decimal places. Now we know our dollars per day. Step two, here's my hint to you. Always calculate the seller's number of days and figure out the taxes the seller is responsible for. Don't figure the buyer's days. In this case, what's our timeline look like? We've got, here's January, here's December, here's April. And it's April 20th. So there's fewer days in the first of the year that the seller's responsible for than there are remaining in the year that the buyer's responsible for. But if our closing was way over here, like December 3rd, the temptation would be to calculate this amount of days because it's less to count. If you do that, I guarantee at some point, you'll probably forget that the seller pays the day of closing. That will somehow be overlooked and you'll get it wrong. But if you always calculate the seller days, and then if it's the buyer's days or tax responsibility that you need to calculate, just take the total minus the sellers to get the buyers. If you do it that way, it's almost foolproof. It'll make more sense when I walk you through it. So, step two, seller's days. And if we're closing on April 20th, from January 1st up to and including April 20th, how many days is the seller responsible for? Here's the way I do it. April is the 4th month. So that means there's 3 full months up to, not including April. So that's 3 months at 30 days a month if we're doing this easier version, not the real life version. Plus April And for April, we only need 20 days of it because 20th is the day of closing. So we've got 90 days. That's 3 times 30 days plus the 20, or 110 days that the seller's responsible for. Are you with me? Make sense? Now, step 3 is just multiplying steps 1 and 2. $6.53 per day times the 110 days equals the dollars the seller's responsible for, $718.30. And so this is going to be counted as a seller debit and a buyer credit. Or I might say it this way, seller debit, buyer credit, just with the initials. So that closing disclosure is going to show up that way. Does that make sense? That's probably the easiest of the 3 possibilities. There are 3 possibilities of how to do this property tax. We've done this one, closing before the taxes are due. All the way up to August 31st, the day before September 1st, this is how you would do it. You're going after the seller's days, dollars per day, multiply them together, and it's going to be a seller debit. Because why? We're taking money away from the seller's column, and we're putting it over to the buyer's column. Here's our seller. Here's our buyer column. We're taking that 718 over and giving it to the buyer. Why? What's the buyer going to do with it? Nothing until September 1st, when they're going to add this 718 to the rest of the money, the part that they owe, which is $23.50 minus 718, and send the entire bill in. Does the closing disclosure need to show the buyer's portion? No, it doesn't matter. We just need to get the seller's piece over to the buyer's column so that the buyer, or their lender probably more accurately, will send in the total tax bill. Does that make sense? We're just getting that chunk from the seller, putting it over there on the buyer's side. All right. That's one possibility. Let's look at another possibility. This time we'll keep the same taxes, $23.50, but let's make it for a different closing day. We're going to have our taxes $23.50, and what was that daily amount? It was $6.53. Keeping that simple, $6.53 a day. This time we're going to close, let's say October 3rd. We're closing October 3rd. So are we closing before or after the taxes are payable? After. So those taxes are going to have to be paid from the closing attorney. That's how that's going to work. They're not going to take the money from the seller, give it over to the buyer and say, okay, buyer, as long as you pay the taxes by December 31st, we're good. Nope. That is not the custom. The buyer's not going to be allowed to hang on to that money. They're going to have to they'll never get the money, right? The seller's portion is not going to go to the buyer's column. It's going to go to the attorney, and the attorney is going to send in the payment. So let's see how this works. You need another piece of information. You need to know, have the taxes been paid yet or not? And so let's say that they have not. The test question will tell you taxes have not been paid. Because if it might be that seller is so conscientious about paying bills that as soon as September 1st rolls around, they send it in. But they didn't do that this time. So you need to know this. Have they paid them yet or not? This time they have not. Here's our timeline. January, December, and this time October 3rd. I can't write these threes fast. I get them so messy. Here's our closing day. Here's our September 1st due date for taxes. Therefore, we need to handle this a certain way. The taxes have not yet been paid. The attorney is going to do this. They're going to collect and figure out how much the seller's responsible for, and they're going to figure out how much the buyer's responsible for, and they're going to collect each of them. It's going to be a seller debit for their portion and a buyer debit for their portion. And then that attorney is going to add them together and send them in to the taxing authority as a lump sum chunk to pay the whole bill. Again, we're not taking the seller's piece and giving it to the buyer to hang on to, even though in every other year after this one that the buyer owns the property, they have until December 31st to pay the bill with no penalties. But this year they don't. If the taxes have not yet been paid, that's not how the attorney's going to do it. They're going to get the money from both. This is not a proration, by the way. We're not taking one chunk from one side, giving it to the other. We're taking a big chunk from the seller and a smaller chunk from the buyer, because that's how much of the year the buyer is still the owner, or the buyer is going to be the new owner. And the attorney is going to send that entire bill payment in, and it's going to be done. So with that in mind, let's see. Step one. Step one, calculate dollars per day. We already did that. We're just recycling from our last question, but I wanted to acknowledge it. Step two, remember my hint? Calculate the seller's days. But Neil, it's less counting if we calculate the buyer's days, and we need that anyway. I promise you, at some point, if you do it that way, you'll forget to add the seller's day of closing. It's the day of closing to the seller's side. So please just trust me on that. Let's calculate the seller's days. From January to October 3rd, here's my helpful hint. Use your fingers or toes if you want to, but October's the 10th month. And so that means there's 9 months at 30 days in the month for 270. And then October 3rd for another 3. So 273 days to the seller. Now we can spend on step 3, calculate the dollars to the seller. And that's simply $6.53 times 273 days. Or $1782.69. And now you don't even have to do this all over again for the buyer's side. You know the seller's portion. So to get the buyer's side, just take the total of $23.50 and subtract the seller's piece. And so the buyer's part is $567.31. And so it's going to be a debit to the seller of $17.82 and a debit the buyer of $567. Why? Because they've not been paid yet. The attorney's going to collect each party's piece, add them together, cut the check, send it into the taxing authority. Are we okay with that one? That leaves us with the third possible way this would be handled. Still closing after September 1st. So we'll say October 3rd. We'll keep that consistent, but this time let's do that the taxes have been paid. So let me get rid of that. Oh, shoot. Let's see. We do it this way. All right. There we go. So here we go. There we go. They have been paid. We're going to step 1, calculate the dollars per day. We can recycle that for this problem. Step 2, calculate the seller's days. So that's still good. And it's still 273. And the dollars that for the seller is still 1782.69. But the taxes have already been paid. So what do we need to do for step 4? We need to give the seller back some money. Because here's what the seller has done. They've paid the taxes for the whole year because they were so conscientious. We need to make sure they get some money back. We need to calculate the buyer's, the new owner buyer's portion, and give that money to the seller. We're going to calculate the buyer's portion and debit the buyer and then credit the seller that amount of money. Again, I highly discourage that you calculate the buyer days at all. So calculate the seller's days, calculate the seller's dollars. Now do that same step 4 that I didn't need to erase. Let's see. There we go. Step 4, the 2350 minus the 1782.69 was 567.31. And what are we going to do with this on the closing disclosure? We're going to take the 567.31, debit the buyer for that amount of money, and give that money as a credit to the seller. Because we need to account for the fact the buyer's responsible for their days on the year of closing and give their money for those days over to the seller credit column. So you might run into any of these 3 possibilities of how to deal with taxes depending on when the closing happens. Does that make sense? The closing time in the year.
And Neil, you're always using that 30-day for the month.
No,
instead of 30.
No, I wish. But again,
Okay.
New this year, I was just being nice because it was our first one. But new this year, they might test you on real number of days and month. So you won't be able to use this little quick trick that I've been doing. You'll just have to know, okay, wait, which month? It's April. So January is what, 30 days. February is 20. I don't think they're going to pull the leap year trick on you. So you can just go with 28. March 31, April 30. Right. And then work from there.
Cool.
I wish I could tell you otherwise, but they changed it this year for whatever reason. Okay.
That also, there's a answer would be A, B, C, D. There should be, you can actually figure out by the number, right? I mean, you don't have to give that answer, right? There should be A, B, C, D, something you have to select whatever it is, right?
Right. It'll still be multiple choice. All the math will still be put in a multiple choice format. That's a good point. So you don't have
that way. That way, you don't need to worry about is 31 days or 30 days. Because I don't know.
Well, they could make that a factor because you are going to have to follow their instructions as which way to do it. And I could see them giving you one answer choice that's one day different in money than another. So you might be faced with that. So you are going to need to actually do the calculation, but you're not filling in the blank with the calculation number. Yeah, good point. So with that in mind, let's look through these slides a little bit as just sort of a generic how-to. Step 1 in calculating a proration, whether it's a proration for taxes, it could also be a proration that involves your interest and your loan amount, because that interim interest involves the loan amount and the dollars per day of interest. Either way, it's the tax value times the tax rate to get the annual tax, or the loan amount times the interest rate to get the annual loan interest. So somehow or other, you're using the rate and the big number to get the smaller number. I need to get rid of that annual rate number. That should say annual dollars. But to calculate the daily is just a matter of dividing by the days, whether it's 360 or 365. They'll tell you in the question which way. For HOA fees, we'll get into some of those as well, but that's going to be figuring out daily, and they're going to tell you the monthly HOA. So therefore, to get the daily per day, divide by 30, right? 30 days. If you know the month total, dividing by 30 days gives you the daily amount. And then Let's see, calculate the number of days to the seller so you don't lose track of the day of closing from January 1st all the way to and including the day of closing. And then the buyer's got to cover from the day after closing through the end of the year for most cases. That's for taxes, or through the end of the month when we're talking about rent or HOA fees. And then deciding what the attribution is. What is it going to be counted as, a credit to one of them or a debit to the other of them? Here's the three possibilities of how property taxes could be handled. If it's closing between January 1st and August 30th, the taxes can't be paid yet, therefore they haven't been, and it's going to end up being a debit the seller an amount of money for their portion of the year and crediting the buyer that same amount of money. If it's a proration, it's one amount of money taken from one, given to the other. And then if the taxes have been paid, like we did there at the end, that last example, we're crediting the seller with the buyer's portion, the buyer's amount they're obligated to pay, because they've paid out for the whole year and we need to give them some money back because they're not going to be owning it for some number of days in the year. And then if neither of them have paid, taxes haven't been paid yet, take a debit from each side for their respective amounts. Let's see. Let me think. Let me make this a little easier. I've got a. Well, let's just do it together. Let's do the first one together because it is kind of a weighty problem. We've got this. This would be an example of maybe a monster question, right? So they're giving you a whole bunch of data and you need to calculate a whole bunch of things because at the bottom, they're going to ask you something like this. What does the buyer need to bring to closing? Out of all of these details for the transaction, how much is the buyer bringing? They could also ask how much is the seller getting, but we're just going to focus on the buyer side. It could be either one that they're actually asking you. So if we see some big question like this, we just work our way down through it, right? So let's do it this way. There we go. Can you still see those numbers? I know it's a little darker. It's so that you can see what I'm going to be writing here in a minute. So if we go down through it, we're going to need that closing date of June 10th at some point. So we'll just kind of make a note. June 10th as a reminder. We'll need that in a minute. Earnest money and due diligence money. Now what I like to do is make a chart and say the buyer's side, the seller's side. We don't really need the seller's side, but buyer's side, debits and credits. And then just keep track of the items as we get to them. The earnest money of $2,000 is going to be counted as what on the buyer's side, a debit or a credit? Earnest money and due diligence, both, by the way, are counted as the buyer's what? Giving them a credit for it or taking money away?
Credit.
Exactly. So both,
Because that money, they already gave it to them.
yeah. Yep. So the earnest money of $2,000, let's just keep track of it here. Earnest money, $2,000, due diligence money, $1,000, both under the buyer credit column. And this is just something you could be doing with your scratch paper. And then the next thing, purchase price of $300,000. Is that a buyer debit or a buyer credit? The sale price.
That's the debit.
A big, enormous debit. You got it. And then the loan to value ratio. Does that need to be under one of these columns or another? How much the buyer is borrowing? Here's how we're going to handle that. They're getting the benefit of it at closing. They're not going to take the entire loan amount and go do something fun with it. They're going to use it and apply it to the expenses, the various debits. So we do, in fact, need to add it and give it to the buyer as a credit. So the loan amount is probably the biggest credit. What is that? It's an 80-20 loan. So 80/20, or I guess more specifically, we could just say 80% of the 300. So how much is that?
40.
240. So there we go. Loan amount of 240,000. Did I hear you right? I think I just want to double check. Yeah. So we're good so far. Just going down the list. What about this loan? The loan is made at a 5% interest rate for 30 years. Why does this matter when they're giving you the loan details? Because of interim interest. We're going to have to calculate that interim interest thing. So let me recap what that means. We've got our month of closing. What is it? June. Actual day is the June 10th day. We've also then got July and then August. So June 10th is the day of closing. Do we have to pay a house payment, our first full payment on July 1st? No, we do not. Because the payment for July isn't going to happen until August 1st. It's covering July. So our first full real house payment is not for over a month away. What we do need to do, though, is figure out the rest of the month of closing. That new lender is going to charge the days left in the month plus the day of closing. So if that's the case, we need to figure out the interim interest by doing this. First, the days, the number of days. 30. We're going to still go with 30. Good. It also happens to actually be right. 30 days minus 10, which is the day of closing, that's 20. But because the buyer is responsible for also the day of closing, we need to remember to add a day for it. So 21 days times the dollars per day. That's where the loan type comes from. We know that the loan amount times the interest rate gives the annual interest. We've done that before. So if we plug that in, 240,000 times what was our rate? 5%? Whatever 240 times 5% is. What is that? 12,000 for the year? I don't have my calculator with me, and this isn't the version that I have a calculator nearby. So our annual is 12,000 unless you tell me otherwise. And so that's our annual interest. We need to turn that into dollars per day. How do we turn annual interest dollars to daily dollars? Let's divide by 360 or whatever they tell us. In this case, we're going to go with 360. And so that gives us what? $33.33 per day. Right? Everybody on the same page? That's going to be our daily dollars. And so if we've got 21 days at $33.33 per day, that means an interim interest dollars the buyer has to pay, debit to the buyer, $700. Let me get rid of all of this stuff so it's not so hard to read. We just need to bring our $700 over and add it to the list. So a debit to the buyer of $700 for interim interest. And I have break time. So let's stop for our break. We'll finish out this thing together when we get back. See you back in 10. Welcome back. Finishing up something here. Made a little exercise for you to do. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. All right. I'll give this to you in a moment. Let's put you in some breakout rooms, have you work on that together. But let's finish up this one before we
Hey.
get to all that. Hey.
Neil, is it, do you have a camera issue today, or is it my hair problem?
No, it's just a weird look because I'm experimenting with some things. So that's not a permanent thing. Let me flip over to where we were. Here we go. That's where we were. Okay. So we left off with interim interest. What is next? We have, origination fee, 1% origination fee. What, who's paying for that? How is that counted? Is that a debit or a credit from the buyer's side for origination fee?
Debit.
Going to be a debit. And so to calculate that origination fee, it's 1% of the loan amount, which is 1% of 240,000. So what is that? $2,400.
Yep.
And then the next one is 2 discount points. And so that's 2% of the loan amount, and we can just use that. That's what we already know. That's another $4,800. 2% of 240 is $4,800. Notice it says prepaid interest. Let me see here. Right there. I have to circle it on the iPad, so I don't have the words on the iPad, so I'm guessing. But we've labeled it prepaid interest points because you could see it as that. It might be referred to as discount points, might be referred to as prepaid interest, or it could be also called lender yield. So anytime you see any of those words, we're talking about discount points. Oh boy. Now they're giving us the tax rate or the tax value. We know what we don't know here, because I need to make sure I put it in. We don't know the tax rate. So let me take a look here. Okay, 9 mils is what we went with. Good. So the tax rate is 9 mils. The tax value is 75% of the market value. And so that means 75% of the purchase price. Purchase price is $300,000. What do we have for tax value? Whatever 300,000 times 75% is. So I've got a tax value of 225. And if we take that number, how do we get the annual taxes? We get the tax value, multiply it by the tax rate. 225. I think it said 9 mils. Let me double check. Yep, 9 mils. That means we need to divide it by 1,000. Tell me if I'm going too fast. So our annual tax bill is $2,025. That's our annual taxes. Step 1, what is our daily taxes? What are our daily taxes? Turn that 225 into daily. We're just going to go with 360 days in the year. Please stop me if I'm going too fast. We're at $5.63 per day. Now,
Yeah, Neil, what did you get that 2025 for property tax? I didn't see in a statement here somewhere say that.
because we know the tax value is 75% of the market value, therefore it's $225,000. And we know the tax rate, which is not actually on this slide. I had to go to the next slide. So I'm just telling you the tax rate is 9 mils. The test question will give it to you. They could have also given it to you in terms of dollars per, like 90 cents per $100, depending on the way that town does it. So 9 mils times 225 is an annual tax bill of $2,025. That makes sense? As long as you have the rate and the tax value, you can get the annual taxes. And then once you have the annual taxes, you can get the daily taxes. And then step 2, let's calculate the seller's days that they are responsible for. When is our closing? Closing is June 10th. And so we've got January to December. We got June right about the halfway point. And so the seller's responsible for this many days. It's going to be pretty darn close to 180 probably, right? So how do we count that? Well, if it's the easy 360 version that they're letting us work with, then we can say June 10th is 10 days plus 5 months at 30 days per month is 150. So 160 days that the seller's responsible for from January 1 to June 10th. So now that we know that 160, step 3, multiply it by the $5.63 per day. For an amount of $900.80. Now, how do we count this on the buyer's side? It's $900 that we are debiting the seller and crediting the buyer. So all we're doing here is figuring out what the buyer has to pay. Therefore, it's going to show up under the buyer's credit column. Credit to the buyer, $900.80. Let me get rid of all of this stuff. Get it out of our way. $900.80. Yet it's this time is one of the buyer credits. What's another one? We got the taxes, property insurance, $740 a year. Here's how we handle that. The standard practice for property insurance is the first year's premium needs to be paid at closing. You have to pay your entire first year at closing. And so that's going to be another buyer debit. So if it's $740 for the year, that's going to be $740 buyer debit. What else? Association fees. Oh boy. HOA fees. They are handled, in this case, they're saying per month. They cost $3,600 per year, but they are paid monthly. So how much are they for the month if they're $3,600 for the year? What are you going to take that yearly amount for and divide it by to get the monthly for HOA? You got it. $300 per month. So divide by 12 equals HOA dues of $300 per month. Now, let's see. How much of this month is the buyer versus seller responsible for? We've got June. Now we're just going to focus on the month of June. We're not looking at the whole year anymore. We know 300 is how much you got to pay for 1 month. How much is the buyer versus seller responsible for? June 10th is the day of closing. And so the seller has to pay for the 10 days worth, and the buyer has to pay for the 11th through the 30th, that amount. So how many days left in the month? 30 minus 11. We've got 19 days. And turn that $300 into daily. So 190 days, or dollars, sorry, that the buyer is responsible for. Did the seller pay them yet? That's the other question, and I don't know if I have that in here. I need to update it. They've got a couple $100 here. We'll do a proper HOA amount, but we'll just estimate it with this amount. Let's say that the fees have not yet been paid. So that's going to be a buyer debit of $190 for HOA for our purposes. What else? Get rid of all this. In the interim interest, did we do that already? Yeah, we did that already. That is it on this problem. Now that we have them all filled out, here's what I advise you to do. Don't go back and forth. Don't zigzag down through here and say, and go right to left. It will be confusing. It'll be mind numbing and you'll lose track of things. Go down this entire column, total it up, and then go down this column, total it up, and then subtract one from the other. So let's take our debit column and go 300,000 plus 700 plus 2,400 plus 4,800 plus 740 plus 190. So all of these things added together is 308. 830. So 308, 830. And then let's do the credit column. We've got, do we have everything we need? We've got our loan amount. Okay, good. That's the main thing. We've got 2,000 plus 1,000. So that's 3 plus the 240 plus the $900.80. So all of these things add up to 243, 980 cents. So the debits and the credits. And now we just do the subtraction. And so what the buyer is bringing is $64,929.20. I know. You might just started thinking something like this. How many points is this problem worth? Yeah, the same number as how much the points are for the question, what is real estate? So some of you might have a strategy. Let's just not do any of the calculations. I wouldn't advise that. But I would say once you get to a big monster question like this, skip it. Finish everything else out. Come back around to this one. It's either going to be two things. You're intimidated by math, and it's just going to freak you out and stress you out for the whole rest of the test. Or you're going to be such a driven competitor kind of person that you're going to spend too much time on this one problem. Don't do that to yourself. Do them all. If you run it, they'll probably put this toward the end of that particular section anyway. But if there are a significant number after this one, just keep on going. Skip it, come back around to it, and don't fall into the trap of doing too much, spending too much time on it. Let's see here. Oh, another thing that this question didn't have in it was escrowing for taxes and insurance. I didn't tell you to do it, but that's another thing they could do in this type of problem. They could say this way, get rid of this. They might also ask you this. They might say that the lender directs the attorney to set up the escrow account or to collect the money to set up the escrow account. So collect 3 months for taxes and 5 months for insurance. It's frequently different numbers for them. For whatever reason, just basically the lender wants it that way. And so if we know the taxes are whatever we know they are, I forgot what they were. Let's say the taxes per year were $2,400. And so therefore, the monthly taxes, when it comes to setting up escrows, it's about the month. How much per month? So we're going to want to find out that taxes are $200 per month. And then insurance, let's say it's $800 for the year. Again, divide that by 12. What's 800 divided by 12? We need the monthly amount, $66.67 per month. And so if the lender wants the attorney to collect 3 months of taxes, it's just going to be $200 times 3 months. So for the taxes, it's going to be $200 times 3 months, or $600. And then for the insurance, it's going to be the 67 times the 5 months, or 333.35. So to set up the escrow, it's going to be $600 debit to the buyer, and then $333.35 debit to the buyer. Does that make sense? Setting up the escrow account, the lender's taking money from the buyer so that that escrow account can have some money in it. And then every month, as they're making a payment, 1/12 extra, one more 1/12 of it goes in, another 12th, another month's worth, in other words, so that it fills up that escrow account to enough, and actually a little more than, so that those two bills can be paid later in the year when they come due. All right. With that said, let me give you this guy. There's a PDF in the chat. Open that up for me. Let me see how it looks. Okay, good. On my end, it looks pretty good. I added a blank page accidentally, but everything you need is on the first page. And it's just the same as what we just did, except different numbers, different parameters. And imagine that you are a paralegal for the attorney, and you've received these instructions from the lender, and they're saying here, let me do it this way. Okay, good. There it is. They're saying this. They're giving you instructions on what you're supposed to collect, and the rest of it you already know because it's your job, right? You know what to do with the price, you know what to do with the earnest money, etc. And I've tried to use more numbers indicative of modern day times, so that due diligence fee is quite substantial because today it is. It quite often is a lot. A more modern rate, things like that. Some lenders do charge more than 1% origination fee. It's up to them what they charge. For whatever reason, that's what they're charging. And then we've got the mill rate for tax rate, homeowner insurance for the whole year, the a couple extra small fees you could see on the problem on the test, a deed recording fee. It's only like $50 to record it at the courthouse register of deeds. The seller's payoff amount. We haven't seen this before. Well, the seller has a loan that has to be paid off, and that loan payoff, it needs to be overnighted to the lender for the final payoff. So they will frequently charge an overnight fee for that. And so what is that loan balance payoff amount that the seller needs to pay? In this case, I've told you $167,000. And then we've got commissions and then excise tax. Don't forget that. And remember who has to pay it. And then the escrow setup. The lender is directing the attorney to collect 3 months of taxes and 5 months of insurance. And then I'm asking for both here because this is going to give you a lot of mileage out of this problem. How much will the buyer need to bring? And how much will the seller end up getting at closing? And so here's what I would suggest. Get some scratch paper and then just basically do this. Buyer's side. Oops, sorry. That should be seller side, buyer side. Make your debit and credit column for both. And then just go down the list, filling them in as you go. I usually will put the title of the item right there in the middle, have enough room there for earnest money, for due diligence, for sale price, whatever it is. And then by the time you're done, you'll just total up these columns and subtract one from the other to get what the seller's bringing. And then total up the buyer's columns and same thing, subtract one from the other to get how much the buyer needs to bring. So could look something like that. I'm going to let you guys work on it together for a few minutes because there's value in that. Let me set up some breakout rooms here. Do you have this? Have you opened it up? Do you have any trouble pulling that up and having it already on your screen? Go ahead and open up that as an attachment so that you have it available. All right, there we go. You should have a little prompt on your screen that lets you go to the breakout room. Let me know if you need something. You can reach out to me from in the room. I'll be checking in, and let me know if you need help. I'll give you a few minutes to do this, more than a few, because it's going to take a minute or a little while, and then we'll talk about it. You having tech problems today, Jack? Is it connection issues?
Yeah, my power has gone out twice now, so I'm not sure what the deal is.
That's no fun.
Yeah.
Are you joining with a computer right now, or did you do the phone?
I'm on my computer, actually.
Okay.
So
well, you can do either as you need to.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hey, Lena, can you hear me okay? There you are. We are, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We're doing a breakout.
Oh,
So let
I'm
me,
sorry about the late.
that's okay. Here, let me send you the problem. I'm putting it
Mhm.
in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll add you to one of the rooms and you can kind of just start
Okay.
picking up and following along. So did you get that? Do you see that? Go ahead and make sure you can pull that PDF and I'll assign you to one of the rooms.
Okay.
That open up okay?
Eh,
Did you get it okay?
Yeah, I'm okay, but I can't find the file. I saw the yeah. Now I'm in.
You see it in the you see it in the chat?
Yeah, I see the problem. Yeah.
Okay, so you see that whole thing. Let me let me put you in a room that you can
Okay.
can talk to them.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
you're welcome. I'll give you guys a few minutes to work on this. It's going to take a little while. Then we'll pull back together and talk about it.
Mhm.
This
Okay.
is it's something that obviously we just got into tonight, so it's a lot of calculations to get to what I call the monster problem. So hopefully that'll be a little understandable.
I think our group is first there.
Hey there, y'all done? How'd that go?
I think there is some issues. There's
Yeah.
a lot, man. I think it's much more than takes time to figure out.
There's a lot to it, isn't there?
Yeah.
All right. Let me let's see. We're pretty close to break. So
Come back after break. I think maybe a good idea.
let me know, what questions do you have? Do you have any particular questions? And then we'll probably just go on to break and then come back and talk from there. But let me know, what questions do you have?
I think one is we have it 3 discount point. What that mean? 3 discount point.
Discount points. It might have been when you were out, but discount points are prepaid interest. In order to get a lower interest rate, the lender would allow you to pay them a chunk of money up front at closing in exchange for charging a smaller, lesser interest rate. So let's say the rates are at 7.5%. If you can't afford a payment based on 7.5%, the lender would let you pay or have a payment based on, let's say, 7% instead of 7.5%. But it's going to cost you a certain number of discount points. To lower the rate from 7 to 7.5 down to 7 is going to take 4 discount points. That's half of an interest rate amount. So I'll show you how to do that. Well, we can kind of do that now since we're waiting. Let's see. Let me do it over here.
You base it off the interest expense?
Let's see. It's based off the loan amount.
Okay.
The discount point. So here we go. Let's look at it over here. So a discount point. For one thing, the cost of a discount point is 1% of the loan amount. However much you're borrowing, they charge you 1% of that to get the discount point. Now, how much does that lower your rate? If the rate is currently 7.5%, and you need it to be 7 in order to be able to afford the payment, then we need to drop it by 0.5%, right? Not 6, but 0.5%. How many 1/8? Here's the other conversion. 1 discount point lowers the rate by 1/8% of interest. So how many 1/8 are in 0.5?
What's a 1/8 is?
1/8 is in decimal.
0.1 or
Yeah, 0.0125. So just that. How many 0.125s are in 0.5? 0.5 divided by 0.125 is 4. That's how many discount points would need to be bought in order to drop the rate from 7.5 down to 7.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right, good. That's all right.
And so therefore, now the next question, how much will 4 points cost? If 1 point costs 1% of the loan amount, 4 points are going to cost 4% of the loan amount. And so I think in this problem, let's see,
There's 3.
It's just going to, it's just going to be
3% of the loan amount.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
Yep. That's what discount points are about. So the main point here is how much does it lower the rate? It's not a 1-to-1 relationship. 1 discount point lowers the rate by 1/8. If fractions freak you out, then just take the 1, divide it by 8, and that's how you'll remember, 1/8 in fraction is 0.125 in decimal. And then you're just
and it's a debit to the buyer.
Yeah, right. Unless they tell you otherwise, but by default, it's a buy. It benefits the buyer, so it's a debit to them. In real life, anybody could pay it. Grandma, an agent, a builder, a seller. Sometimes in a buyer's market, sellers are desperate to get buyers, the opposite of what we're dealing with now. And the seller might say, hey, if you buy my house, I'll pay or I'll put $10,000 toward whatever you want, including discount points. So that might be a real world application that you could run across. So yeah, that's it. for the discount points. Sometimes, and in this type of problem, the monster problem, it doesn't really matter that you do them individually. So the origination fee, I think we charged 1.5 in this problem, plus the discount points, which, let's see, I forgot how much we charged in this problem for discount points. What was that? Oh, three discount points. So you could just add that together and get it all done in one chunk and say, we just need to calculate and take from the buyer 4.5% of the loan amount, which is a combination of the two. But if the problem is a small little micro problem asking just for origination fee or just for discount points, obviously you'd have to do that accordingly. But does that make sense? We're just trying to calculate numbers in these big questions, these big kind of problems.
Yeah.
All right, let me pull people back in. We'll go ahead and take our break once everybody comes in. Any other questions while we're waiting? What else was weird to you? Did you get
What is that lender interim interest, whatever
Oh,
I think?
yeah. So that's another important point. That is, here's how it works with the house payment. So we've got our closing month, and our closing month is November in this case. 17th is the actual day. The next month after that, of course, December, and then January. So when you own a house, you probably know this, you pay in arrears. You pay after you've lived there, right? Like rent, you don't. It's the opposite. With rent, you have to pay before you live there. But the first full house payment will not be December 1st. The first full house payment is going to be January 1st for having had the privilege of living there in December. So therefore, that leaves this interim interest chunk that needs to be determined for the rest of the month of closing. That's what interim interest is. The interest the lender is charging the buyer for the new loan for the privilege of living there from November 17th through the 30th. And so to calculate the number of days, by the way, interim interest is the only situation where the buyer pays for the day of closing. The seller pays every other case. But if the buyer's paying for the day of closing, we're just going to figure out those days were left in the month with 30 minus 17, right? And what is that? That's 13 days. Don't forget to add in a day for the day of closing. So we need to account for 14 days that the buyer is responsible for, and then multiply that by the dollars per day of interest. That is what interim interest is. So how do we get the dollars per day? In this case, we were told that the mortgage is at a 7% rate. We were also told that the loan amount is 90% of 550. So 550 times 90% to get the loan amount of 495. And then that 495 times the 7% is an annual interest of 34,650. And then we need to turn that into daily interest. So divide it by 360. I'm still being nice, keeping it the easy version. $96.25 a day. Divided by 360 equals the $96.25 per day times those 14 days. So it's going to be $1347.50. By the way, guys who just came in, I'm not jumping ahead of you. They ask a question about interim interest. I'm just catching them up on that sort of thing. We're going to go over this whole thing when we come back from break. I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. And enjoy your break. We'll do some math. going to share this with you. Just a second first. Let's see. Okay, how'd you feel about that? It was a little overwhelming, kind of a pain. The good part about the practice problems for these monster problems is that it's everything. It's all the individual ones. So you're kind of practicing that. But then the annoying part is that if you get any of those multiple dozen calculations wrong, it throws off your final one. That's why I suggest doing the multiple column method. So like what I've done here is I made a different version with a little more. I realized I could make some more space. So on scratch paper out to the side, write the columns, and then at the end, the important part is to total up the individual columns. And for the buyer, you will take the debits and subtract the credits, and you'll end up with the amount the buyer needs to bring. And then for the seller side, it's the opposite. So you're gonna total up all the columns for the seller's debits, all the ones for the credits, and this time you will subtract the debits from the credits, and that's how much the seller's getting. That way, if you're off, if something's weird, when you're doing practice problems and you know what the answer should be, it's easier to go and dissect it and figure out where in this line of numbers was the problem. And then also, if you're off on the answer choices in the actual test, because the multiple choice test is going to give you 4 options, and maybe none of them are quite right. So it's easier for you to go back and dissect the issue one thing at a time if you do it this way. Use that scratch paper, do the columns, write it out. So here's what I've got. I went down through and I made the columns. It's messy, but I've got the buyer's side debits and credits, the seller's side debits and credits, and then I'm just filling in the blanks. I'm referencing the title of the thing in the middle. So earnest money, due diligence money, origination fee, all those things. And then wherever I can fit it into the table, I'm doing so like this. The loan to value ratio of 90%. I just went ahead and wrote what that comes out to. 90% of what? 90% of the price of $550 is $495. So it was right there. The space was available, so I wrote it there. And then down here for the tax value, and we'll go through these things in a minute, but the tax value is 85% of the market value. So again, 85% of 550 is 467,500. So there was a space, I wrote it in. And then the 9 mils, now that I know the tax value, I can multiply that by 9, divide by 1,000. You might be able to kind of know, not do the math in your head, but know what you need to do in your head. And then that comes out to the 4207.50 for the year's taxes, the annual taxes. So with that said, I've been making my way down through here. First step, I just lined up the price because the 550 purchase price needs to show up in these columns. And 550 purchase price is what the buyer's paying. That's the biggest debit, so that's the buyer debit. Sell price, 550, right there. It is a double duty number too, because while it is the buyer's debit, it's the seller's credit. So it's showing up in 2 columns, one for each side. Then the earnest money, here's a little side note about earnest money to pay attention to. Earnest money is not given to the seller, is it? It's sitting in an escrow account. Probably the attorney's escrow account or trust account. It could also be one of the real estate firms. But earnest money and due diligence both are going to count as a credit to the buyer. No surprise there. Does the earnest money count as anything from the seller's side? No, because we haven't given it to the seller. It has nothing to do with the seller. So don't put that anywhere on the seller side. It's just going to show up as a buyer credit. But the due diligence money is different. Because back when we went under contract on the effective date, that due diligence money went to the seller, payable to the seller, which means it's a buyer credit, but it also needs to be reflected on the settlement statement as a seller debit. Because if we don't do that, we will be giving the seller the due diligence money 2 times. We did it back on the effective date and we'd be doing it again at closing, so the math doesn't work. So due diligence money has to show up under the buyer's column and the seller's column as a credit for the buyer and as a debit for the seller. You with me on that? Just make that little mental note. And then origination fee. Okay, now we're getting into some calculations. Origination fee. I usually just go down the list of whatever the given information is. I'll go in the order they give it to me. And so the origination fee this time is 1.5% of what? Of the loan amount. That's why I went ahead and put that in the chart there. So the loan amount is $495, and we just need to calculate 1.5% of $495, which is $74.25. And then I just put it in the column under debit. Yep.
But the loan amount is actually 5,000 or 550, right?
The purchase price is $550. The loan amount is $495 because the purchase price right here $550, and then they're borrowing 90% of that. The loan to value ratio is 90-10 or 90%. Does that help? That makes sense? Okay, good. And then discount points. Those are 3. And all we need to know is how much they're going to cost. We don't care what that lowers the rate down to. For our purposes, all we need to know is how much they cost. We do know that 1 discount point lowers the rate by 1/8, but they're not asking us a question about that. All they're asking us is how much to collect from the buyer for it. And so it's just going to be 3% of the loan amount. So there's that $495. This time, go 3% of that to get $14,850. And so I've put that another item under the buyer debit column and labeled it discount point or DP. Good so far? Now, taxes. That's the next thing mentioned. Tax value is 85% of market value. Went ahead and did the math. 85% of the price, sales price, also called market value. 85% of that is $467.5. That's one thing we need for tax determination. The other thing we need is the rate. And the rate is 9 mils. So if we go up here, nope, it's not up there. Where did I put it? Oh, maybe I didn't. We know the tax value of $467.5. Let's do it right here. Tax value, $467.5. The rate of 9 mils. Need to divide that by 1,000. And if we plug all that in, we're going to get the annual taxes. Divide, oh no. All righty, one more time. The annual tax bill is $42,0750. There's our tax total for the year, and that's what I have right here. So now I'm working on figuring out what to do with the taxes, debits and credits. We also know from the problem that the taxes were not yet paid. So now we know what we need to do with it. Since they're not yet paid, it's going to be a seller debit for the seller's portion and a buyer debit for the buyer's portion of the year's taxes. So that's what we're working on over here. Step 1, figure out the daily taxes. $42,0750 divided by 360 to get $11.69 per day. Step 2, always start with the seller's days. Again, to keep track of the day of closing, I don't want you to mess that up. And so the seller's days are going to be, since we're closing on November 17th, it's going to be 17 days in oh my goodness. Okay, one more time. 17 days in November plus 10 months, because it's the 10th month is the month before November. 10 months at 30 days per month, 300 plus 17. So the total days the seller's responsible for, 317 days. And then step 3, basically step 1 times step 2. So 1169 per day times 317 days. Or the seller's paying $3705.73. Now that we know what the seller's paying, we know that's got to be a seller debit. We already figured that out when we looked over here and realized, oh, the taxes have not yet been paid. The attorney's going to collect the seller's piece and the buyer's piece, add them together, cut one check, and send that in to the city or the county or whoever they pay. Now that we know the seller's piece, we can calculate the buyer's. So step 4, take the total taxes of 4207. Forget about calculating days anymore. We don't need to do it that way. We can just work with the dollars that we have, because the dollars to the seller taken away from the total dollars of taxes gives you the dollars to the buyer, which are 501 of them. 501.77 buyers dollars debit the buyer. So now we're going to put that over on this chart. The seller's taxes, 3705.73. Let's see, seller debit, 3705.73. I'm going to label it taxes. There's the seller's piece. And then the buyer's part was 501.77. Right there. We okay so far? It's just systematic, right? Step by step. Next thing, I'm kind of checking things off as I go too. So we've done taxes, homeowners insurance, $870 a year. We're going to do 2 things with this homeowners insurance amount. We're going to need to satisfy 2 questions with it. Well, first of all, we know that we always pay the entire first year premium at closing. And that's at the buyer's expense. So $870 needs to be another buyer debit. And I'll call it insurance premium. We don't need to do anything on the seller's side for that. The other place the insurance is going to pop up is further down the list. We'll get to it when we go down there, but just giving you an idea, we're setting up the escrow account. The lender has given the attorney the instructions to set up the escrow and collect 5 months of insurance. So it's going to be whatever that was, 870 divided by 12 equals whatever, and then that's going to be times 5. We'll do that in a minute. Well, I guess we may as well do it now. 870 divided by 12. We need to know the monthly. Is $72.50. And the lender wants 5 months of it. So times 5 is $362.50 to debit the buyer to create the insurance escrow. $362.50. Another buyer debit. Can you tell that we're going to have a ton of line items for the buyer? So insurance escrow. Now, since we're talking about escrow, we may as well finish that out and do the 3 months of taxes. We'll just send that one over here. How much are taxes for the year? We figured that out, didn't we? And if we know the taxes are $4207.50 for the year, we know how to get the per month. So $4207.50 for the year. Divide by 12 months is $350.63. That's crazy that they got so close. Actually, the total is not the same. And so then they're telling us to collect 3 months of taxes So 3 months times the 350, 63. So 1,051.89 is how much we need to collect from the buyer to set up the escrow for taxes. How are we doing so far? I've gone kind of fast. Are we hanging in there? Good so far? What else? Let's go back up. We did insurance. Oh, interim interest. That little unicorn. Lender wants you to collect interim interest. And I did that on another page over here. It's kind of messy. Let's see here. So November 17th is our month of closing, day of closing. We know that we're not going to have to pay a full payment until over a month from now, because mortgages are paid in arrears. That's going to cover the December month. Therefore, we just need to account for the days left in the closing month, including the day of closing. So 30 days minus 17 is 13. And then add that extra day in. So that's 14 days the buyer's responsible for paying interim interest. Is this too messy to tell what I'm doing? Or are we okay? 14 days. Now we need to figure out the dollars per day. And I'll just rewrite this. 7% interest. Get out. Oh, go away. They're messing up my writing. 7% times the loan amount of $495 gives us the $34,650 per year annual interest dollars. Turn that into daily dollars to get our $96.25 per day. And now that we know the dollars per day and the number of days, 14, I think it's somewhere around step 4 when you figure it out. Multiply them together. 14 days times 96.25. So 1,347.50. We okay there? That's interim interest. Do we know what that's about? Don't forget, the day of closing has to be paid also, because this is the buyer only. This has nothing to do with the seller. It's about the buyer's new loan. The buyer's paying this whole thing. 1,347.50. Let's go put it over here. That's another buyer credit, debit. 1,347.50 for interim interest. Hanging in there. What's next? Deed recording fee. Who pays it? Who cares if the deed gets recorded? This deed recording fee. These little one-off things that you don't have to do any calculation for, when I'm going down through my scratch paper, I'm just going to make a little note. Buyer's paying. That's a buyer debit. Buyer debit. Seller payoff overnight fee. Got to pay off the seller's existing loan. That's going to be a seller debit because they care about their existing loan getting paid off. So let's make a buyer debit for $50 for the deed recording, and a seller debit for $75. Buyer debit for $50 for recording. Seller debit for $75. Oops. For payoff. Trying to keep this somewhat lined up. The seller's loan balance. Oh, so in addition to paying $75 to ship it, how much is the actual payoff? It's going to be paying them off $167,000 to pay off that seller's existing loan. So that's another big fat seller debit. What'd I just say? 167. 167,000. I'll make a note that 75 was to mail the payoff, and then the 167 is the payoff amount. All right, I got to straighten up. I'm getting a little messy. What's next? The HOA fee. And then I sent you a broadcast message. I don't know if you saw it, that the HOA has been, what'd I say? Has been paid. Or did I say not? Oh, no. Oh, shoot. Do you remember what I said? Do I have a record of that somewhere? Now I'm trying to remember. Oh, I know what I did. I can find it over here. Sorry, guys. I'm a little flaky right now. Seller has paid. I did it because I copied another example. So the HOA fees have been paid. That tells us what we need to do about this. HOA fee is $270 per year, paid monthly. Let's go over here and do it on our scrap paper. HOA. I just forgot. Oh boy. 2,700. $2,700 per year, paid monthly. How many dollars per month is HOA? If it's $2,700 a year, we don't even really need that. What we need is per day. So $2,700 per year is what per day? Divide by 360. It's $7.50 per day. And then we're closing. I keep forgetting things. We're closing on the 17th. Yeah, 17th of November. Right here. Here's November. And so if the seller has paid the whole month, we're just going to calculate it for the month. Then we need to give them some money back. Well, how much is the buyer's? Well, let's do the seller's portion first. The seller portion the seller does need to pay for is for 17 days. So 17 days in the month times $7.50 per day. Oops. Or $127.50. That's the seller's portion. And I guess it would be smart to have the monthly amount, because then all we got to do is subtract the total. So $2,700 divided by 12 is $225 for the month minus the $127.50. The buyer's portion is $97.50. So that's what we need, because that's how much we are going to credit the seller and debit the buyer. You with me? It's sort of like a little mini version of tax proration, just within the month instead of within the year. So $97.50 will be credited seller and debited buyer. I think this might be the first proration. HOA. Sometimes, and they'll tell you in the instructions, but we're not doing it this way this time, but sometimes they'll tell you that the entire HOA for the first year needs to be collected. But again, the scenario is this. The lender is sending the whole loan package to the attorney. The attorney paralegal is the one who's doing really all the work. And she is carrying out the wishes of the lender. Collecting the monies the lender directs her to. And so that's why we are doing what we're doing. We're acting like a paralegal. So next your question you have for me is, okay, Neil, then why are we doing this? I'm not trying to get a paralegal's license. I'm on a real estate license. I agree. I don't know why we're doing this, except that they want you to know the behind the scenes, I guess. buckle up, because in post licensing 302, we go even further. You've got to do all of this, but then also know where to plug it into the closing disclosure statement. I'm sorry for that. I don't get the point. So many of us instructors are like, why are you testing them on this? Test them on exactly what we need to do in the field, which is double checking the math, right? But that's a soapbox that I won't get on right now. So we've handled the HOA. Now we do commissions. Who's paying the commissions? It's 6% of what? So 550 is the price times 6%. And then we're going to attribute it to who? It's going to be $33,000 paid by the seller. Seller debit for $33,000. We're almost there. And then excise tax. Who pays it? It's going to be based on the price. Oops. 550. What do we do about excise tax? Divided by what? Gives us $1,100. We don't even need to worry about change because it's a nice even dollar amount. $1,100 paid by the seller. And the last thing on this sheet is the escrow setup, which we already did. So we're done. We just need to total things up. Let's double check. We got 350 and some change and 1,051. I think I did put that in there. Yes. 350. Or did I not? 360. Oh, right. Okay, good. Yep. So that's all I've got. Now we're going to go through and add up the columns. Let's do this column first. The debits. We've got 550 plus 7425. I'm sorry, 25 plus 14,850 plus 501.77. 870, 362.50, 1,051.89, 1,347.50, and 50. So I'm getting 576, 458. and 66 cents for total debits. Now let's calculate total credits. Going to be this column. And we've got 6,000 plus 35,000. So that's what, 41,000 plus $97.50. And those are all the buyer credits. Wait, nope. We've got a major buyer credit we almost forgot about. What did I leave off?
The loan amount.
You got it. That's a big one. That would be a problem. $495 for the loan amount. Let's don't forget that. We'll just kind of cram that in there, loan amount. So now, $4,100, 6,000. Sorry, plus 5. Sorry, that's a. Sorry, the messiness is getting me. 6,000 plus 35 is 41,000, plus the 97.50, plus the 495. So I get a total there of 536,097.50. I think that's all of them in that column. So we have what we need to figure out what the buyer needs to bring. I'm just gonna do that subtraction. 4, 5, 8, 6, 6. Oops, darn it. 5, 7, 6, 4, 5, 8. So buyers bring in 40,000, 361, 16. Did you guys get that? Thumbs up, head shake, head nod. Okay. That's what the buyers bring in. Now let's do the seller side. Less items. The debit side for the seller, 35,000 plus 3705 plus 75 plus 167 plus 9750 plus 33,000 plus 1100. And if I didn't screw that up, I get 239, 978, 23. And then those are all the debits. And the only credits to seller, because the taxes aren't a credit, that could be one possible seller credit, but since the taxes have not yet been paid, it can't be in this case. But that could be one that shows up. There's not many seller credits besides the price. And in this case, there are none besides the price. So seller's getting 310, 21.77. There you go. How do we feel?
All right. In this is the one, whatever, let's say. This is not just one question. This must have more than one questions, right?
This could be one question, or maybe two. They would either ask, "What's the buyer bringing?" or "What's the seller getting?" This is more like this is two questions. They could give you the same numbers like we did here and ask those two questions. For one thing, what does the buyer need to bring to closing? And then the other question, what will the seller be walking away with at closing? But again, they all count like 1.5 points or whatever the math works out to be. They're all the same point value. And so how long did that take us? It took us like 15 minutes at least. And so you better have all the other ones. I'd rather you get 10 more questions answered than being determined to get this one question, right? So definitely low-hanging fruit first. Answer everything you can. Come back to this one at the end. It's unfortunate because on the other hand, you're going to be tired. It'll be the last thing you're doing with that strategy, so your brain will be tired. But I think it's just not worth getting so caught up in this thing that you look up and you realize, oh my gosh, 20 minutes have passed and I've only done one question or two questions, right? So test taking strategy is important. Here's a couple things I want to give you. In the chat for your study, there are two versions of the same thing. I'm giving you a PDF version and a PowerPoint version of this. Let me show it to you. It's another one of these, but it breaks down all the calculations individually. So here you go. This is what I just put in the chat for you. And it's a scenario, not the same one, a whole different scenario where we have a closing date, earnest money, due diligence, purchase price, all the stuff. And then not only that, but the step-by-step of each one. Here's how the loan to value works. And then they're keeping a tally in the upper right corner of how much you need to, in this case, the overarching question is, how much must the buyer bring? And then also, how much will the seller get? So it's just kind of going down the list, shows you how to do each individual one. I'm about to cough. And just sort of talks you through it. So I'll let you spend time on that on your own. I'm not going to belabor that point. What questions do you have so far? Are you worn out? You feel like Mike Tyson just paid you a visit? Yeah. Who's waiting till July? Any Tyson fight fans? How do you feel about that coming up? It's not a real estate question. He's fighting a YouTuber, guys. A pretty sturdy YouTuber. We'll see. I hope he's not too old. I'm rooting for Mike. So yeah. Oh, and then also like an extra credit part of this PDF is what's the buyer's monthly payment going to be? Just on more things that we talked about over in the finance section. The part about how much will your loan balance be after the first month's payment, that sort of deal. Yeah. So that's what that is. Let me see here. Let's revisit our buddy, the syllabus, for a minute. Where do we stand? We've talked about agency. We've talked about brokerage practices. What we still need to talk about is the fair housing chapter, which we will do. We also need to talk about valuation. That's probably one of the few remaining bigger chapters. And then also, I'm going to have to look back in my notes, either property management or landlord and tenant. I don't remember which one we still have yet to do. One of them is what we still have yet to do. And then we're going to revisit the comment section of the license law and commission rules chapter or material. So what does that mean? Valuation is 6 hours. Fair housing, anti-discrimination, that's 7.5 hours. Landlord tenant, it's probably going to be a couple more hours. Now we're at 9. Plus, we need to come back around and spend some time on the state section, particularly license law, commission rules. And we have about 20, I think 16 or 20 hours left. So we've got plenty for the content remaining, plus a couple of review days. So that's my plan. That's the strategy. Don't forget, let me see here. Closing, 55. Can you hear that dog? He's scratching. Okay. Here's our contracts chapter where we went through the entire contract as per the syllabus. And then here we go. The closing section. Sorry for all the skipping. I hope I'm not giving you a seizure. Closing procedures, somewhere around page 61. Hopefully, I think it's the same thing for you. You have the same version of the syllabus. I would go down through the syllabus, think about what we've talked about in class, fill in the blanks, right? In this case, there's no blanks to fill, but provide to the settlement agent as soon as possible. I think I told you that they're going to send out an information sheet to the listing agent. The attorney's going to send that. The attorney's also going to send an information sheet about the buyer to the buyer's agent. And they're going to ask them to please send us a copy of the contract, any addenda or amendments. By the way, this is in the very beginning. Within the first week or so, maybe the second, the attorney's going to send this out and we're going to provide them with the info. Except for the sensitive information, by the way, like social security number, loan information. I'm not going to be the go-between because of loan fraud potential. I'll direct my client to contact the attorney at a phone number they figure out on their own. I don't even want to give them the phone number. The commission says don't do that because, again, if I've been hacked and I email them a phone number or an email address, that could be part of the scam. So besides the sensitive info, I'm going to give them all the other stuff. And social security numbers, I'm going to let them do. Contact info for the buyer's lender. I'm going to tell the attorney, here's who the buyer's using. As a buyer agent, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to also, as a listing agent, give the attorney the lender info for the seller. Because why? They need to arrange the final payoff. Sometimes you might be so on top of your finances that you know what your loan balance is any given day, any given month, but that's not going to help you. When it comes to preparing for a closing, we need to get that number from the seller's lender, or the attorney does. We don't have to. The attorney needs to know the lender's info, the loan number, the phone number, and the name of the lender, and they're going to work that out. So that attorney paralegal is going to figure out and say to the lender, we need a payoff statement from you as of this closing date, plus a couple of days, by the way, because it needs to ride the FedEx truck or wherever, however they do it, to send it off. And that lender, remember the interim interest, they want their money. And so they're going to pad it and make sure they get all their money. There's no free ride with paying off that lender. They're going to want to have the payoff to include the time it takes it to drive across country to pay them. Any surveys that were done, any required inspection reports, there's usually not a lot of, if any, required inspection reports, maybe a wood destroying insect, but not even that most of the time as far as needing to give it to the lender. And then the insurance binder is the official document that the insurance agent sends to the closing attorney and says, this is what they picked. This is the policy. And this, more importantly, is the dollars, the cost of that insurance premium. I think we had $870 for the year in our scenario. So it's that's what I'm talking about. That's how the lender finds out what to allow for collecting that first year's premium, and then what number to use to calculate the monthly, so they can figure out the escrow collection. Buyer's due diligence, we went into all of that. Any sort of loan pursuit, applying for the loan, the appraisal to make sure the property is worth the purchase price. The survey is always a great idea, but not required. But for us, as the broker, we need to have something in writing that says, I told you you should get one. Don't sue me, bro, because I told you so. If they refuse, by the way, you'll want to get it in writing that you told them so. And it looks like this. Where'd it go? There it is. Right here. This is magical. By the way, enter firm, whatever firm you join. I have a feeling your broker in charge is not going to give you your money from this closing unless and until you give them all the paperwork, including this form. Because here's what it looks like. The professional services disclosure, it says, hey, client, I told you should get a home inspection. You don't want it? Then please initial here saying you turned it down. They're usually going to go along with that. But some of the ones that they typically might not immediately want to get might be the add-on things like radon, maybe a septic inspection, maybe where'd it go? Survey. Yeah, the survey. That's a big one, because a lot of times it's not until maybe a couple of weeks into the process that the survey gets done. But we want to make sure anything they turn down that we suggest, and by the way, suggest everything. You always want to have the waiver signed and initialed. This also gives you a place to put the service provider you're recommending and that who's going to order what. But the main thing is that if they turn you down in your advice, that next year, here's the situation, and then we'll be done. Acquaintance of mine in the business, he got the business, I didn't, from somebody that we both know. She would call me every so often throughout the years. I knew her from high school, and I'd go show something to her, and then she would just ghost me. And I would do it again another year or two later. And then when she actually did do something, she used the other guy. And so when he helped her buy the thing, because she was about to get married and it was going to be her and her new guy, their house, they bought it. And then 1 year later, they split up. And so she wanted to sell the house. And so that buyer for her had a septic inspection. And they revealed that the leach field of the septic system was completely crushed. I guess a heavy truck drove across the yard and crushed it. And so it would cost $5,000 to repair and replace that leach field. And what she realized was, wait a minute, when I bought this only 1 year ago, my real estate agent, not me, thank goodness, did not tell me to get a septic inspection. And so she went ahead and paid the $5,000 to the buyer because the buyer wouldn't close without it. And then she came after that agent and said, wait, you never told me to get a septic inspection when I bought it. Surely the leach field didn't go bad in just 1 year's time. And he had a decision to make. He could either, I'm sure he talked to his broker in charge. He probably also talked to an attorney when he was presented with this situation that, she wants me to give her $5,000. And he was probably told, well, you can either pay the $5,000 and get her to just be quiet and hope she doesn't complain to the commission, or wait till she complains to the commission. You now get disciplined by the commission for a material fact situation, and then also probably pay at least the $5,000. He chose A. He went ahead and paid her the $5,000, and I don't know if she ever turned him in or not. But if he had this, that would have become a non-issue. He could have pulled this paperwork out and said, hey, last year I told you to get the survey, the septic inspection, right there it is, and you turned it down. Here's your initial. Here's your signature. He could have saved himself $5,000 from this one form. That's why your BIC to be, I guarantee, will require some version of this before they give you your money. So that's just sort of part of the whole process, guys. Where do we stand? Oh, wait, sorry. Yeah. So we're going to pick up, keep going down through that syllabus, catch up if you're falling behind. Read every bit of the syllabus of the items we have covered so far. Fill it out, mark it up, write on it, turn it into a review document, because again, this is about the time when you're going to start reviewing. Now, in addition to spending time learning new material, you need to budget some time reviewing old material too, so that it'll all be kind of manageable in another month or so when the rubber meets the road, so to speak. That test comes up. So let's see, next step, when we come back tomorrow, you're going to bring me anything you have questions about from the midterm, right? Bring me questions from that. We'll go over those at the start of class. And then also we'll go on into the valuation chapter. I think it's unit 17. Let me double check something here. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that's it. So yeah. So go to unit 17, whatever that is in the syllabus, and we'll talk about valuation. It's about a 6-hour piece that we'll definitely spend a lot of time on tomorrow. Have a great 20 hours, guys. If you haven't taken the midterm yet, go ahead and knock that out for tomorrow. And again, Jason is going to add a finance chapter quiz to class marker by next week, by the end of the week, or at least by next week. So be looking out for that. And I'll see you tomorrow night. Take care.